The text I'm reviewing today is the first two chapters of The Politics of Crisis Management, Public Leadership Under Pressure. It was first published by Cambridge University Press in 2005. Having consumed a large amount of readings regarding national security and leadership from Australian authors, it is really interesting to read the first two chapters of this book, which hail from the United States. It begins by pointing out that it is aimed at public leaders and how they can improve their handling of crisis management. I am not currently working in the national security environment, so for someone standing on the outside trying to force their way in, I found it very useful for reasons I will now discuss. The book begins by trying to sketch out a broad definition of what a crisis is. A serious threat to the basic structures or the fundamental values and norms of a system which under time pressure and highly uncertain circumstances necessitates making vital decisions. The authors then state the kind of crisis they're going to be talking about are the crises that feature time compression. For example, the scenarios where public leaders do not have the luxury of time to make a decision. The book states what most crises have in common, and I think this is particularly relevant to students doing this course, is that they create nearly impossible conditions for leaders. Managing the response operation and making urgent decisions while essential information about causes and consequences remains unavailable. I think this is a brilliant description of significant terror attacks, including 9/11 in the US and more recently the Lindt Cafe siege here in Sydney. Chapter 1.2 ends prophetically. Leaders can prepare for crises of the future only if they learn from the variety of experiences they themselves and other leaders have had in other types of crisis. The book then mentions that crisis management is only getting harder, saying that citizens in Western society are getting more fearful and less tolerant of major hazards to their way of life, a culture of fear sometimes referred to as risk society. That's a fairly ominous statement considering the book was written a decade ago. Halfway through Chapter 1, the authors argue that crisis leadership can be divided into 5 critical tasks. They are sense-making, decision-making, meaning-making, terminating, and learning. I think this is particularly relevant to students in week 5 of this course, seeing as we have been learning about the role of communication in the risk management process. Chapter 2 is dedicated to sense-making and begins with reference to the September 11 attacks in the United States. It describes how various elements of the national security community in the US had substantial information on the hijackers, but the information wasn't shared. Individuals in different silos kept the information to themselves, and the tragedy unfolded. The book then illustrates the difficulties associated with information sharing across large departments and organisations. One key reason it suggests is that information gets politicised, or different people across organisations can't agree on what the information is telling them. Another reason it lists is that most government departments are not geared towards rapid decision-making. Chapter 2 then describes some alarming examples of what it calls normalisation of risk, or organisations creating a false sense of security. It then cites as an example how the US Department of Transport performed disastrously in the media spotlight in the wake of the ValueJet crash of 1996 in Florida. The Department of Transportation Secretary was quoted on TV stating that ValueJet was a safe airline to fly. The department's Inspector General flatly contradicted the Secretary, revealing ValueJet's safety record was 14 times as poor as other discount airlines. The authors then round on some so-called fantasy documents, including one widely derided statement by the US Postal Service that it would be able to keep functioning even after a nuclear holocaust. The book states this misplaced optimism could make things worse by giving policymakers a false sense of coping capacities. The authors also used the 1986 Challenger disaster as an example of the dangers of the normalisation of risk, particularly how engineers at a subcontractor tried to urge NASA to delay the launch over concerns over the performance with O-rings. The warnings were ignored and the disaster occurred. I have greatly enjoyed reading this small sample of the text and am encouraged to read the rest of the book. It is particularly relevant to this course as it is aimed at public leaders and outlines some of the problems of risk communication across large organisations. I especially find it helpful that for almost every example of poor decision making, it highlights a historical example. I thoroughly recommend The Politics of Crisis Management, Public Leadership Under Pressure to other members of the class.